All right, so today's lesson is about solving rational equations. So to solve a rational equation, you can use two different methods. So one of the methods is cross multiplying, which is one that we've used before in this class and in like algebra 2 or algebra 1 and geometry. And then the other version is multiply by the least common denominator. So we may get more than one answer per problem, but because we're working with fractions, so that's what a rational equation is, something that has a fraction. If there's an x in the denominator, then you will have a restricted domain. So the denominator is not allowed to be 0, ever, since dividing by it will cause an error. So if you get two answers, or even if you get one answer, make sure it works and it doesn't make your denominator 0. So if we look at number 1, our first method, we're just going to use cross multiplication. So this happens when we have two fractions set equal to each other. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out what the restricted domain is. So I'm just going to go ahead and write over here my RD. And we're just looking for what number is going to make a denominator 0. So this one doesn't have any x in the denominator, so there's not going to be any restricted domain for that fraction. But if we look here, there is an x, so there's probably something that will make it equal to 0. So we need to figure out what that is and then take it out of our function. So if we get that as an answer, then it's not going to work. So I'll solve this for x. So I'll subtract 1 from both sides. So 2x equals negative 1. And then divide by 2, so x equals negative 1/2. So because we're talking about a restricted domain, we're saying that x can't equal negative 1/2. So if we get that as an answer, it's not a valid answer. So let's go ahead and cross multiply. So we're just going to multiply these two. And we get 4 times 2x plus 1. And then multiply these two. And we'd get equals 7 times x minus 6. So always write it out like this first so you know that you need to distribute. So we're going to multiply 4 times 2x, which would give us 8x. And then 4 times 1, which would give us 4. And then on the other side, 7 times x is 7x. And 7 times negative 6 is negative 42. All right, then from here, it's just solving an equation. So just getting all your x's to one side, everything else to the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 7x from both sides. So we would have x plus 4 on the left side equals, these cancel out, so we'd have negative 42. All right, and then we still have that plus 4, so I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, and we'd get x equals negative 46. So make sure to check that against the restricted domain we found. So we said x can't equal negative 1/2. Negative 46 is not negative 1/2. So we are good to go. That's an appropriate solution. Okay, so let's do another one. So on to the next problem. Now we have two denominators that have x's in them. So we have x plus 4 and we have x plus 10. So we're only worried about the denominator, which remember is the bottom of the fraction. So I'm going to set both of those equal to 0 and figure out what x cannot equal. So if I subtract 4 from both sides, that would be negative 4. If I subtract 10 from both sides, that would be negative 10. So x can't equal negative 4, x can't equal negative 10. And this is the kind of thing too, like I don't need to see all your work for this. If you can just like tell me from the beginning that negative 4 and negative 10 can't work, then go for it. So if we look at this one, we're going to cross multiply. So I'm going to cross multiply here and make sure we write this as x plus 4 times x plus 1. So we have to write them in parentheses so we don't forget to FOIL or to distribute or do anything like that. And then on the other side, we're going to have x minus 2 times x plus 10. All right, so now we have to FOIL both sides. So we're going to do x times x, which would give us x squared, x times 1, which would give us x, 4 times x, which would give us 4x, and 4 times 1, which would give us 4, equals, and then distribute the other side. So we're going to FOIL. So x times x gives us x squared, x times 10 gives us 10x, negative 2 times x gives us negative 2x, and negative 2 times 10 gives us negative 20. All right, and then we need to just simplify each side and then solve our equation. So on the left side, I'm going to combine my like terms. I have x squared plus 5x plus 4 equals x squared plus 8x minus 20. Okay, so now get everything to one side if we can, or get all of our x's to one side and everything else to the other side. So I'm going to subtract x squared first, but notice that our x squareds are just going to cancel out. That's kind of good because that means that we won't have to factor anything. So all we have left is the 5x plus 4 and the 8x minus 20. And then we need to get our x's to one side and everything else to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 5x from both sides. And we get 4 equals 3x minus 20. And then we add 20 to both sides. So we would get 24 equals 3x, because this cancels. Divide both sides by 3, and we get x equals 8. All right, so if we check that against our restricted domain, we said x can't equal negative 4 and x can't equal negative 10. 8 will work. 8 is not either of those numbers, so we are good to go with that answer. All right, let's do one more of this type, and then we're going to move on to the other kind. So if we cross multiply, or sorry, first thing, we need to find our restricted domain. So both of the denominators are x plus 4, so we only have to solve once because it'll just give us the same answer. If x plus 4 equals 0, then x can't equal negative 4. Okay, because if we plug negative 4 in, we'll get a 0 in the denominator. So let's cross multiply. So we have negative x times x plus 4. Make sure you put them in parentheses, because I'm sure it's easy to forget that, and then you'll forget to distribute. So we need to multiply these two. So we'd have x plus 1, x plus 4. All right, and then let's multiply everything together, simplify, and solve our equation. So if I distribute my negative x in, I'd have negative x squared. Negative x times 4 would be negative 4x equals, and then we're going to FOIL. So x times x is x squared. X times 4 is 4x. 1 times x is x. And 1 times 4 is 4. All right, and then let's simplify. So we have like terms we can combine on the right side. So we'll just rewrite the left side because there's nothing to change right now. We'd have x squared plus 5x plus 4. All right, so I'm going to move, because we have x squareds, I'm going to move my x squared first. And I'm going to move everything to the right side, because our x squareds aren't going to cancel this time, so that means we're going to have to factor. So we would have 2x squared plus 9x plus 4. So remember, that's just by combining like terms. So we have 1x squared, add to 2x squared. 5 plus 4 is 9, and then the 4 is just by itself, no like term. All right, so we're factoring this. So we need to look for, so since we have a is not 1, we have to do 2 times 4, which is 8, and figure out what multiplies to 9. So 8 times 1 would give us 9. So we're going to set this up as 2x squared plus 8x plus x plus 4. So we're just replacing that middle term. I'm not going super into depth into factoring. Group the first two, so our GCF would be 2x. You have x plus 4. GCF would be 1 for the second two, x plus 4. So our two factors would be 2x plus 1 and x plus 4. All right, so we need to set those both equal to 0 and solve for x. So we're going to have 2x plus 1 equals 0 and x plus 4 equals 0. So subtract 1 from both sides. 2x equals negative 1. Divide by 2, x equals negative 1/2. And then for the other one, just subtract 4 from both sides, so we have x equals negative 4. So you can look now, we have to check against our restricted domain. So our restricted domain was x cannot equal negative 4. Since we got that as one of our solutions, we have to cross that one off because it's actually not going to work. But negative 1/2 will work because it's not negative 4. So we're going to go ahead and only have one answer, even though it looks like we had two. You can also kind of tell from here where you got this factor, x plus 4, if that same factor is in the denominator, then you know it's not going to work. So if they match, then it's not going to be a good solution. All right, so then the other method we have is solve using the least common denominator. So this is where we need to kind of pull some information from before and figure out what our least common denominator would be. So if we look at this first one, first thing I'm going to do is find my restricted domain. So we only have one variable in the denominator, that would be n. So if we just said n can't equal 0, n can't equal 0, that's our restricted domain. So if we get 0 as a solution, then it's not going to work. All right, so now for our least common denominator, so our LCD. So we have the denominator of n, and we have the denominator of 3. This one just has a denominator of 1. So if we just multiply those three together, I guess, 3 times n times 1 would just give us 3n. So 3n would be our least common denominator. So what we want to do with that least common denominator is multiply every fraction by 3n. So we're going to multiply by 3n to all of these fractions. And I'm going to write it out as 2 times 3n is 6n equals, and then we have 3 times 4, which would be 12n, and then we still have it over n, plus 3 times 1 is 3n over 3. All right, so what we're looking for is for something to cancel out. So if we look, 6n, nothing cancels, we just rewrite that because it doesn't have a denominator. 12n over n, the n's will cancel, and all we're left with is 12. And then 3n over 3, the 3's will cancel, and all we're left with is n. Okay? So now what we do is we just solve. So we just solve this like we normally have, get all of our n's to one side, and then divide. So we're going to subtract n to cancel that out. So we'd have 5n equals 12. And then to solve for n, we divide both sides by 5. 12 over 5 is not a pretty number, so we're just going to leave it as 12 over 5. Our restricted domain, we said n could not equal 0, so we are good to go with our answer because it's not 0. All right, let's look at the next one. So for this function, our restricted domain, there's no denominator that has x in it, so there's going to be no restricted domain. So we're just going to go ahead and look for the least common denominator. So we're trying to think about what number could 3, 5, and 6 all go into. So you can kind of list out the factors if you're stuck on finding the least common denominator. We can just kind of like think about it as looking at your biggest number in the denominator, which is 6. And I'm going to write out all the numbers that 6 goes into. So it goes into 6, and you can kind of check as you go. Does 5 also go into 6? If you multiply, no, so we have to keep going. Then 12, 3 goes into 12, but 5 doesn't go into 12. 18, same thing, 3 goes into it, but not 5. 24, again, 3 goes into it, but not 5. And then 30. 3 goes into it, and so does 5. So 30 would have to be our least common denominator. Okay, so this kind of process, this can happen in your head. This is just kind of like if you're completely stuck on it, list out the factors of the biggest number and it'll make a little more sense. So we're going to multiply each fraction by 30. All right, and let's see what we get. So we have 2 times 30, which is 60x over 3, plus we have 30 times x minus 2 over 5. Save yourself a little work and don't distribute this 30 in until we can cancel anything out. And then 1 times 30 is 30 over 6. All right, let's see what cancels. So 60 divided by 3 is going to give us 20x plus, and then 30 divided by 5 is 6. So we'd have 6 times x minus 2 equals, and then 30 divided by 6 is 5. Okay, so the whole point of multiplying by your least common denominator is so that you can cancel all the denominators out. All right, so next part is just distributing, combining like terms and solving for x. So 20x plus 6 times x is 6x. 6 times negative 2 is negative 12, and that equals 5. Combine like terms, so 20 plus 6x is going to be 26x minus 12 equals 5. So 26x equals, if we add 12 to both sides, 17. And divide both sides by 26. Can't simplify that at all, so we're just going to leave it as 17 over 26. So now we need to check it against our restricted domain, which we didn't have one, so this answer is good to go. All right, next question. This one is a little more complicated because we have a little bit more going on in the denominators. So let's find our restricted domain first. We have x minus 1, we have x, and we have 2x. So if we set those all equal to 0 and solve for x, then we have x can't equal 1, x can't equal 0, and 2x, divide both sides by 2, so x can't equal 0, which we already have up here. So we're just going to use this little part. All right, so let's go ahead and find our least common denominator. So our least common denominator in this case, we want to look what they all have in common. So these two share an x, so we know it's going to have an x. Give myself a little more room. So we're gonna have an x. This one has a number of 2, so it's got to have a 2. And then x minus 1, we're going to have x minus 1. So the only thing they share that these two share is an x, so we don't have to multiply them together, but everything else we just have to multiply into our least common denominator. So now I'm going to multiply everything by that least common denominator. So 2x times x minus 1 times 2x, x minus 1, 2x, x minus 1. Okay, and then we're just going to rewrite it. So I want you to do this rewriting step. I don't want you to skip any steps. So x times 2x would give us 2x squared. X minus 1, again, don't multiply anything out into the parentheses until you've canceled, because you might make it harder on yourself. So we're going to do 3 times 2, which is 6x, x minus 1, over x. equals 2 times 5 is 10x times x minus 1 over 2x. All right, and then from here, we're just going to figure out what cancels and then solve. So this first fraction has x minus 1, x minus 1. So all we have left is 2x squared. The second one, the x's will cancel out. So we have plus 6x minus 1 equals 10 divided by 2 is 5. And then the x's cancel out. So we just have 5x minus 1 left over. All right, and then from here, it should be a pretty easy problem to solve. So we're going to have 2x squared plus 6x minus 6 equals 5x minus 5. So I just distributed everything in. And then we're going to get everything to one side and factor. So I'm going to subtract 5x, add 5. So we'd have 2x squared plus x minus 1 equals 0. All right, and then we factor. So figure out what multiplies to negative 2 and adds to positive 1. So that would be 2 and negative 1. So I'm going to skip the grouping part because I've gone through that multiple times. So if you need help with factoring, let me know. But we're going to have 2x minus 1, x plus 1 equals 0. Solve both of those for x. So we'd have 2x minus 1 equals 0 and x plus 1 equals 0. And then solve. So we're going to have 2x equals 1, x equals 1 half. And then for this other one, x equals negative 1. All right, so check both of those against your restricted domain. We said x couldn't equal 1, and we said x couldn't equal 0. Both of these work. Neither of those are 0 or 1. So we're good to go. So that one has two solutions that both work. All right, we're going to do one more together, and then I'm going to have you do the other ones on your own. So if we look at the next one, our restricted domain, we have x plus 2 in both denominators. So I'm only going to set it equal to 0 once because it's just going to give us the same thing. X plus 2 equals 0, so x can't equal negative 2. So remember that when we get to the final solution. All right, so our least common denominator for this one is pretty easy to find because we only have two denominators and they're already the same. So our least common denominator is just going to be that denominator we already have. So we have times x plus 2 times x plus 2 times x plus 2. And make sure that whenever you're multiplying by something that is more than one term added together, that you put it in parentheses. So for this first fraction, we're going to have x plus 3 times x plus 2 over x plus 2 equals 1 times x plus 2 is just still going to be x plus 2 minus x plus 1 times x plus 2 over x plus 2. Okay, so all we did was multiply the top by our least common denominator, and now we're going to cancel out if we can. So we have x plus 2 over x plus 2, so we're just left with x plus 3 equals x plus 2. Obviously, nothing's going to cancel for this one because we just have it over 1, so it just stays x plus 2. And then for the last part, make sure you remember that we have this negative. X plus 2's cancel, and we have x plus 1. Don't forget to leave this in parentheses because we have a negative to distribute in. So let's do that. The left side stays the same, and then let's multiply this in. So we'd have minus x minus 1. Combine like terms, so we'd have x plus 3 over here still. X minus x, those cancel out. And then 2 minus 1 is 1. And then we're going to subtract 3 from both sides to solve for x. So x equals negative 2. Okay, so we got one solution. We have to check it against our restricted domain. But our restricted domain says that x cannot equal -2. So this is actually not a valid solution. And because it's the only one we found, then we're going to have no solution. Okay, so it's important to check against your restricted domain. All right, I want you to try 8 and 9 on your own, and I want you to show them to me before you start working on anything else, and then you can work on your choice boards. Okay, please let me know if you have any questions on this stuff.